Saudações, viajante do tempo. Close your eyes for a moment and come with me to the region of Verdun, a small duchy in the 11th century, right when the twilight of a busy day finally yields to the serenity of night. Feel the cool, damp air rising from the freshly soaked earth, carrying the scent of hay and the faint smoke of fireplaces being lit in the few stone houses of the village of Ethelred. There's a deep quiet settling over everything, interrupted only by the slow, rhythmic sounds of night beginning. I'm just an old historian, ready to whisper forgotten stories. If sleep comes along the way, I'll be glad. But tell me, from what corner of the world did you find your way to me? And if you're here, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. The sky above Ethelred was already dressed in a deep indigo-blue mantle, where the first stars, tiny pieces of silver hope, started to appear shyly. You can almost feel the cold, rough texture of the uneven stones that pave the small central path of the village, in sharp contrast to the soft, dark mud of the dirt road stretching beyond the walls. The predominant sound now was the slow, heavy creak of a supply wagon preparing to leave the village, a sound of old wood and groaning iron, announcing a long vigil under the fragile protection of moonlight. The young Lysander, the driver of that lonely machine of motion, could barely be seen in the darkness, just a determined silhouette in the fading light. Lysander wasn't an experienced merchant. He was a traveler who carried more than goods. He carried a promise made to a distant relative, a small parchment sealed with honor. That invisible burden weighed far more than any bag of grain. He felt the night tighten around his thick wool cloak, his only defense against the increasingly sharp air, as he moved away from the warm hearths. The smell of fresh bread from a closed bakery now mixed with the wild, earthy scent of the approaching forest, a smell that announced both vastness and danger. His heart, steady but alert, held the faint pulse of uneasiness familiar to anyone who knows what awaits beyond the safety of the village. Leaving Ethelred was always a silent milestone, the point where protection ended and personal courage had to take command of the journey. The heavy wooden gate, almost fully shut, left a narrow gap through which Lysander's wagon slipped with a dragging sound. The bolt slammed behind him with a finality that drew a line between the known world and the unknown. He pulled the reins firmly, feeling the vibration of worn leather under his fingers as his horse, a sturdy animal named Danton, began its steady march across uneven ground. In that moment, the darkness of the road became a vast, silent embrace, demanding that every sense stay awake. A small curiosity about the 11th century, the idea of a road, as we think of it today, barely existed. Most routes were simply dirt paths that followed old Roman trails or dried riverbeds. Their maintenance depended entirely on the goodwill of local lords or abbeys. Traveling was slow, uncomfortable, and dangerous. Deep ruts and holes threatened to snap wagon axles every few miles. Lysander felt all of that with every violent jolt that shook his body, constant physical reminders of how fragile his wagon really was upon the harsh earth he had chosen to face. The scent of pine and damp moss thickened in the air as they reached the edge of Sylvangard Forest, a broad stretch of ancient trees whose tangled branches swallowed what little light remained. The temperature dipped another degree, and the young man tugged his hood lower, shielding his face from the cold dew already settling on leaves and grass. Touch became essential. The cold air against his skin, the heavy wool on his shoulders, the coarse wood beneath him, and the subtle rhythm of the reins guiding Danton in a delicate dance of strength and trust. At first, the darkness had seemed uniform, but now shadows shifted in layers, strange shapes that moved with the rocking of the wagon and the faint flicker of his oil lantern. The muffled thud of Danton's hooves formed a hypnotic rhythm, sometimes the only proof that he was still moving forward through time and space. Lysander knew that sound, comforting to him, could also be an invitation to unfriendly ears lurking in the bushes. Medieval forests were havens for outlaws, hunting grounds, and battlegrounds for pure survival. Every traveler carried that knowledge carved in the back of their mind. The feeling of being watched was an old companion of lonely roads. A tingling on the back of the neck that refused to go away. Lysander didn't ignore it. His gaze stayed forward, but his ears listened for any break in the night's melody, a branch snapping, a rustle not caused by wind, or a distant howl that might mean wolves. A hungry pack was no myth, but a real and constant threat. Fear didn't paralyze him. It sharpened him. The wagon started climbing a small hill. Danton's heavier breathing echoed briefly before melting back into the thick quiet. Lysander stood slightly, easing the horse's burden, feeling the ache in his legs, an old discomfort that would follow him for many days. The reward for the climb was a brief opening in the sky. The crescent moon cast a pale silver ribbon of light down the road ahead. He remembered a story told by an innkeeper. A traveller who, convinced he was being stalked, sang a hymn at full voice. Supposedly, the bold melody scared off thieves hiding in the dark, afraid patrols would hear. Lysander didn't sing, whether from instinct or shyness, but he whistled a simple melody instead. A thin, trembling sound that floated through the forest, offering both himself and Danton a sense of human company in the vast emptiness. A small act of defiance against the smothering silence. The road worsened, turning into a patchwork of loose stones and deep pits that forced the wagon to move at a crawl. Rainwater had gathered in dark puddles, reflecting flashes of lantern light like tiny sheets of broken glass. Lysander leaned forward, trying to feel the movements of the wagon and anticipate each jolt, balancing himself with instinct and tension. Then, a smell reached him. Not the warm smoke of household fires, but something sharper, like a campfire recently put out. His body tensed, and his whistle stopped mid-note. Only Danton's cautious steps remained. In the 11th century, a roadside camp was almost always a sign of danger, raiders, deserters, or men who wanted no part of village law. A wise traveller avoided them whenever possible. Lysander wrapped his fingers around the hilt of the short sword hidden beneath the bench. The cold metal grounded him. He wasn't a skilled fighter, but a weapon was a declaration, a last defense, and a reminder of the courage required to travel alone through medieval lands. A branch snapped to his right. He froze. The sound didn't come again. Slowly, the tension drained from his shoulders, leaving behind a sharp rush of adrenaline and a heartbeat that thumped just a bit too fast. He rubbed his thumb along the reins to calm himself and urged Danton to move quicker, hoping to leave that unsettling stretch behind. The fading smell of smoke followed him a little longer, a quiet reminder of how fragile peace was in the dark. At last, the road softened, becoming smoother and sloping downward, letting the wagon settle into a steady, flowing rhythm. The noise shifted from groaning wood to a gentle, rolling glide. Lysander leaned back for a moment and let his gaze rise to the sky. Now fully open, a blanket of ancient stars shining across a black velvet dome. That sight alone made the world below feel less threatening. A soft murmur of water reached his ears. A small stream running somewhere near the road, fresh water sliding over stones. The gentle, constant sound washed tension away. He imagined dipping his hands into it, cool, clean, and bright. For a traveller, water was life, and a hidden spring was often safer than a village well. There was also a belief among travellers that road spirits clung to lonely wanderers, making them sleepy and confused, so they'd lose their path and be robbed. To ward them off, people tied small bells to their wagons. The faint ringing was meant to keep both sleep and evil spirits away. Lysander had tied a small bronze bell to his wagon, and its soft chime now sounded like a charm cast into the night. The scent of wet soil grew stronger, mixed with the pungent aroma of wild mushrooms thriving in the darkest, dampest corners of Sylvangard. Lysander breathed deeply. The air was cold and sharp, but clean, and there was something comforting in the sheer, overwhelming presence of the forest. Nature was silent, but it was not cruel, not the way men could be. His thoughts wandered to the promise he carried, and to the tired eyes of the relative who entrusted him with it. That memory warmed him more than the cloak on his back. Determination, he realized, was hotter than any wool. He reached forward and brushed Danton's neck. The horse's warm coat, soft and steady, reminded him he wasn't completely alone. The road widened into a small clearing, just a glimpse of open field, and the wind blew harder without the trees to block it. Lysander grabbed his hood before it flew back, feeling the cold sting of the wind across his face. Even if the wagon moved slowly, the night reminded him that time never stopped. Somewhere ahead, he hoped to spot the old twisted tree that marked the halfway point for travelers crossing Sylvangard in the dark. And so, under an open and endless sky, he continued his silent vigil. A small, determined traveler in a vast, uncertain world. His wagon drifted forward like a slow boat on a river of night, guided by moonlight and the promise of dawn. And as Lysander disappeared into the dim horizon, let your mind rest in the steady rhythm of hooves, in the scent of pine and earth, and in the quiet whisper of the road leading him onward. The night in the region of Verdun was like a tapestry of dark velvet, dense and untouched by any artificial light. Lysander's night vision slowly adjusted to the dimness, allowing him to make out the twisted silhouettes of Sylvangard's trees lining the road. He had travelled a considerable distance since leaving Ethelred, lulled by Danton's steady pace into a quiet state of contemplative vigilance where thoughts drifted as freely as the cold air around him. There was loneliness, yes, but it had settled into something more stoic, something almost peaceful. The modern traveller had become an ancient guardian of his own fate, knowing that on those roads the only certainty was slow movement and the unknown waiting ahead. The smell of pine resin and damp earth grew stronger, the pure essence of the forest itself. The young man touched the small leather pouch tied to his belt, checking for the coins and, more importantly, the sealed parchment that was the true heart of his journey. He repeated this little ritual every hour. It was his way of steadying himself, of remembering why he was facing cold nights, danger, and exhaustion. In the 11th century, with no banks and rare letters of exchange, trust and sealed documents were the real backbone of important dealings. That piece of parchment was worth more than all the grain in his wagon, sentimentally and practically. The moonlight, once shy behind thin clouds, finally broke free and bathed the road in a silver, dreamlike glow. Dust and mud seemed transformed into a pale ribbon leading forward. The contrast between the deep darkness under the trees and the pale glow at the center of the road created a scene both beautiful and mysterious. The temperature had dropped again, but Lysander could feel the comforting warmth radiating from Danton's body, a simple, quiet refuge against the cold night. Suddenly, the peaceful rhythm shattered. A loud crash echoed behind him, splintering wood, clashing metal, and a startled shout. Lysander yanked the reins, stopping Danton at once. His heart raced, adrenaline lighting every nerve. Someone else had met misfortune on the road. Now he faced his first decision: keep moving or go back and help. He climbed down from the wagon, with quick, careful steps, one hand already on his sword's hilt. The oil lantern cast a trembling circle of amber light, barely pushing back the night. The scent of hay and manure, so familiar, now mixed with the sharp smell of spilled wagon oil and freshly broken wood. the scent of an accident. The cry he heard wasn't one of pain, but frustration. That eased his chest slightly, but not his caution. 50 paces ahead, he saw it. A large merchant wagon, far bigger than his own, with a wheel completely destroyed, sunk into a deep rut. A burly man with a red beard and fine wool clothing rubbed his head in pure fury. This was Gautier, a dealer in fine fabrics from distant Aquitaine, and his wagon was filled with silk and brocades, a treasure trove for any bandit in the forest. Gautier cursed in a dialect Lysander barely understood, but frustration needed no translation. Between wide, frantic gestures, the merchant explained that he had hurried his journey, fearing bandits who had attacked a nearby caravan. In trying to dodge a puddle, he had missed the deep hole left by recent rains. Fear, haste, and anxiety had betrayed him, a reminder that on the medieval road, calm was safer than speed. Lysander immediately saw how dangerous the situation was. The broken wheel would take hours to repair, time they didn't have, and the heavy wagon was a beacon of wealth. 2 men, even armed, wouldn't stop a band. His solitude on the road had ended, but danger had tripled. A small note about medieval travel. Repairing wagons was a constant struggle. There were no roadside workshops. Every traveler depended on his own tools and skill. Spare axles and iron rims were essential cargo, but Gautier's damage was far beyond a simple fix. The mechanism needed a full replacement, impossible on a dark forest road. Lysander ran his fingers along the broken wood, rough and splintered, and felt cold oil dripping into the soil. He offered Gautier some of his watery wine and a piece of dry bread. Simple things, but enough to calm the man and build a fragile bond of trust. The humble smell of cheap wine and stale bread gave them a moment of human comfort in the cold emptiness. The wind picked up. Somewhere in the distance, something moved through the brush. Both men froze and exchanged a silent look. The fear that every traveler carried, the possibility of eyes watching from the dark, had become real. Lysander spoke quietly but firmly. The fabrics were valuable, but their lives were worth more. They needed to abandon the large wagon and ride together on the smaller one. Fewer shadows, less noise, and less temptation for thieves. Gautier hesitated. His fortune was sitting right there, vulnerable to the night, but fear finally broke through pride. He grabbed a small box of coins and a bundle of documents, leaving almost everything else to the fate of the forest. He joined Lysander, climbing aboard the smaller wagon with a heavy sigh. Danton adjusted to the added weight, hooves striking the earth in a stronger, quicker rhythm, escape made visible in sound. As they rolled away, the image of the abandoned wagon fading behind them, the night seemed to swallow its silk and silver, a sharp reminder of how fragile all possessions were. They traveled for nearly an hour. They spoke in short whispers about the road ahead, pedagium posts, safe villages, farms that might offer shelter. This exchange was precious. In the Middle Ages, knowledge of the road was as valuable as gold. 2 travelers meant twice the wisdom, twice the eyes, twice the chance of survival. The temperature rose slightly, a sign that dawn was moving toward them. A thin mist spread across the open fields to their right, turning the world into a pale, floating dream. Lysander rubbed his eyes, feeling the ache of sleeplessness, but urgency pushed him onward. Bandits might already be searching for the abandoned wagon. They needed distance before sunrise. Gautier reached into his bundle and pulled out a fine wool blanket. He wrapped it around Lysander's shoulders without a word. The softness and warmth were a surprise, a small act of gratitude that made the night feel a little less cruel. In the Middle Ages, survival often depended less on law and more on the simple courage of strangers helping one another. The scent of morning dew slowly replaced the sharp smells of the night. In the eastern sky, a pale grey began spreading, dawn's first promise. Relief washed through Lysander's tired body. With daylight, most dangers faded. Sight would return. So would hope. The wagon kept its steady pace. Gautier, exhausted after fear and loss, fell asleep with his head awkwardly resting against the side. His deep, rhythmic breathing was oddly comforting, a sign of trust and of life continuing quietly despite everything. The forest thinned. Fields and low stone fences appeared, signs of farms and civilization. In the far distance, the first thin columns of chimney smoke rose into the pale sky. Safety was near, and it felt like a warm hand touching the heart. Lysander smiled to himself, a tired, grateful smile, and tightened his grip on the reins. His journey, which began in solitude and doubt, now carried a companion and a shared purpose. Courage, he realized, wasn't just facing danger alone, but being willing to open space for another soul in the darkness. The wagon kept moving gently toward the awakening world. The sun finally broke over the horizon, painting the sky in soft oranges and pinks. A delicate warmth settled on the road. The small wagon, now a refuge for two, rolled slowly into the light, a silent invitation for other brave travelers who might join the path ahead. Feel the first light of that medieval sun on your skin, the quiet relief that morning brings, and know that the journey continues, slow and steady, guided by the rhythm of hooves and the courage of those who share the road. The sun, now fully risen, washed the road in a gentle gold, thinning the mist and revealing the rugged beauty of Verdun's countryside. Lysander felt the welcome warmth on his skin and the scent of warmed earth and evaporating dew, a fresh, bracing smell that chased away the colder odors of the night. The fatigue was still there, a slow weight in his limbs, yet the relief of having survived the darkness and of having a safe companion renewed his strength. Danton's rhythm had shifted to something slower and more reflective, a careful step over terrain the sunlight now exposed in all its imperfection. The young driver studied the road ahead, noticing the texture of stones and the soil's changing hues from dark brown to light grey, a natural mosaic that told the region's geologic story. His eyes caught on a shape at the horizon, the silhouette of what looked like an abandoned watchtower, a relic of an older time, now just a mute reminder of the need for constant vigilance. He kept a wide berth from the forest's shaded edge. Daytime was safer, yes, but it still hid subtle traps. Gautier, the merchant, woke with a start, disoriented for a moment before remembering the loss of his wagon and goods. His discouragement hung thick in the air, almost tangible, but he soon gathered himself with the practical acceptance of someone who knows that, in the Middle Ages, fortune and misfortune were neighbors. He thanked Lysander with a simple nod and shared a saved piece of hard cheese, its salty, strong bite, a welcome contrast to the dry bread from the night before. What the road demanded, what their story now turned on, was union. Threat had forced two strangers with very different aims together, one carrying a promise, the other a fortune lost. This bond reflected a common social truth of the time. Caravans weren't just clusters of merchants, but bodies of mutual defense, where risk thinned out through numbers and shared courage. Travel became a communal act of survival. Gautier began recounting the caravan raid that had terrified him, describing the bandits' method. They didn't kill, but took everything and left travelers naked, a humiliating, dangerous fate that made recovery nearly impossible. His voice, rough and a little anxious, served as warning and lesson at once, a piece of vital intelligence that Lysander absorbed like armor. The air's texture shifted, growing warmer and drier as the sun climbed. The scent of dew gave way to the warm dust lifted by the wagon wheels and Danton's hooves. Lysander's ears tuned not only to the forest but to the road ahead, listening for the signs of other travelers, a deep wish to swell their tiny caravan and strengthen their mutual safety. Far off, a thin column of smoke rose from a clearing. Hesitation gripped both men. It could be bandits cooking a meal, or a peasant family traveling and seeking refuge. Lysander drew the reins and whispered to Gautier that they should angle closer to the forest's edge, a common tactic to avoid unwanted meetings while using the trees as cover for quiet observation. They slowed. The wagon rolled more softly over a bed of dry leaves, Danton's hooves thudding in a muffled, almost stealthy rhythm. The smoke smell grew stronger, wet wood and something roasting, a homely, harmless scent that eased the tension. Dry branches and leaves brushed against Lysander's cloak, a tactile reminder that they were moving along the thin border between the wild and the civilized. Lysander halted the wagon and climbed down carefully, crawling to a vantage point behind a thick shrub. Peering into the clearing, he saw a scene balanced between fragility and resolve. A man, a woman, and two small children sitting around a small fire, eating a simple porridge. They were clearly peasants in rags, holding few possessions, yet the woman kept a steady, watchful gaze on the tree line, a quiet guardian, a small note of history. Peasant families on the move were common in the Middle Ages, fleeing war, famine, or oppressive lords. These small human journeys were the true pulse of the roads. Travel for them wasn't a choice, but a desperate necessity, carrying little more than their craft and hope. A protective impulse stirred in the young traveler. He stepped out from his hiding place and walked slowly toward the fire, hands raised in peace. The peasant, a thin man named Emile, sprang up and grabbed a heavy staff, but his wife, Isabel, calmed him as she took in the sight of the wagon and Lysander's unthreatening posture. Tension softened into a brief exchange of words and intentions. Emile explained, voice roughened by fear and road dust, that they were fleeing a punishing tax imposed by a new baron, a burden that had made village life impossible. They had no certain destination, only the hope of finding a fairer duchy to start again. Isabel kept a close eye on Gautier, weighing this new pair with the wary instinct of someone repeatedly betrayed by luck. Surprisingly, Gautier was first to suggest joining forces, offering to share what remained of his provisions in exchange for Emile's company and watch through the night. Emile looked slight but strong and practical. The little caravan grew, born of fear and need, and with each new companion, the group's strength rose. Union, once more, proved the only true armor against the age's dangers. The peasant family quickly broke down their small camp and settled onto Lysander's wagon. The added human weight and few belongings pushed Danton into an even slower measured pace. The presence of young children, with their soft voices and stifled giggles, brought a tender note to the journey, a gentle counterpoint to the road's constant strain. Lysander felt the sun on his neck and the dry southern wind on his skin. The trip had shifted from a solitary mission to a shared responsibility. He passed the reins to Gautier, and they began to alternate. Practical relief that offered brief rest and shared vigilance, a crucial step in managing the long road's fatigue. The baby's soft cry, quickly soothed by the mother, became another note in the road's quiet symphony, mingling with the wagon's creak and the low murmur of Gautier and Emile discussing safer routes. This new weave of sounds and lives felt comforting, a sign of purpose and motion that made the invisible threat of bandits a little less oppressive. On they went, a tiny caravan, a moving microcosm of medieval society, different classes and aims bound by a common vulnerability. The lone, heroic journey Lysander had imagined gave way to a warmer, more complex truth. Survival by collaboration, where one person's duty might become another's salvation. The smell of earth and sweat, mixed with the damp moss rising from roadside ditches, clung to the overcrowded wagon. Yet the physical discomfort was outweighed by the relief of company and the comfort of growing safety. The young driver watched Emile and Gautier talk, the peasant offering practical advice on wood durability and how to shield cargo from the weather, while the merchant shared knowledge of market prices and trading in the towns ahead. This exchange of skill was its own quiet currency, brute strength and land-born wisdom traded for commercial knowledge and social capital. Interdependence was simply part of medieval life. Feudalism separated the classes, but the road forced them together, shaping temporary bonds of equality and respect. Isabelle, the peasant wife, kept a discreet watch, her eyes fixed on the tree line, her ears tuned to sounds the men overlooked, the wind in the leaves, the sudden cry of a bird that might be a warning. Her devotion to her children added a quiet layer of gravity to the caravan, a reminder of the priceless life they were all carrying. A small historical curiosity. In the Middle Ages, traveling parties were often safer when women and children were present. Some thieves, out of a twisted code of honor or fear of religious retribution, avoided attacking groups that included innocent families. Isabelle and the children offered a strange, unexpected form of protection. The sun reached its zenith, and the midday heat grew heavy. Danton's breathing slowed, deeper and more labored. Lysander guided them beneath the shade of a great oak, its centuries-old branches offering a small sanctuary. The horse drank from a nearby stream, and Lysander leaned back against the rough bark. The solid, unchanging texture of the tree was strangely comforting in such an uncertain world. The smell of freshly cut grass and wildflowers in the clearing replaced the dusty scent of the road, an unexpected moment of sensory peace. They shared the last of the cheese, and Isabelle passed out tiny honey breads she had saved. The sweetness was simple, but felt like luxury. As they rested, a distant sound broke the calm, the unmistakable rhythm of hooves in a fast gallop, urgent, dangerous. The men immediately rose, their eyes fixed on the road. Too loud to be a single rider, they hid the family and their most precious belongings among the bushes and braced themselves. But what rounded the bend wasn't a band of thieves. It was a lone rider, a knight, armor streaked with dust, the left sleeve of his chainmail torn, his arm bleeding heavily. Lord Valerius, a noble from a nearby fief, now wounded and fleeing. He barely managed to pull the reins before collapsing onto the dry ground. Lysander and the others approached cautiously. Curiosity was immediate, but action came first. Valerius wasn't a peasant or a merchant. He was a symbol of power and law. His presence in the caravan was dangerous, but also brought protection no soldier would dare ignore. His wound, deep and ugly, needed care. Gautier surprised everyone. He had learned basic field first aid during his travels and immediately got to work, cleaning and bandaging the wound with a clean strip of cloth from his pack. His courage, unafraid of blood or dirt, was a quiet heroism. The strong smell of the healing herbs he used filled the air, sharp and medicinal. With a weak voice, Valerius explained, he had been attacked by mercenaries loyal to a rival lord and was trying to reach a distant monastery, the only place that could grant him political asylum. His presence in Lysander's wagon made the journey infinitely riskier, but also far more important. They now carried a symbol of authority. Lysander's wagon had become a tiny caravan of survival, a young man of honor, a fleeing merchant, a peasant family seeking refuge, and now a wounded knight. The horse would need unbelievable strength to carry this burden, and Lysander stroked Danton's neck with gentle words, feeling the warm vibration of the animal's body. The cold touch of Valerius's armor, the sharp smell of blood and iron, these new sensations reminded everyone of the larger conflict outside the forest. Lysander helped steady the knight, whose body grew heavy with fever, the hot, sick heat of someone fighting exhaustion and pain. The caravan was now complete, an unlikely patchwork of lives stitched together by the road itself. The wagon's slow rhythm after lunch became a rhythm of healing and escape, the drumbeat of hooves promising a safe destination ahead. The sight of Lord Valerius, a noble, being tended by a merchant, carried by a young wagon driver, protected by peasants and their children, was a poetic undoing of medieval hierarchy. Lysander felt both honored and terrified by the responsibility. The little caravan moved on again, fading into the afternoon light, a small collection of hopes and fears in motion. Let yourself hear the steady sound of hooves, the gentle murmur of voices, and the peace of daylight as you travel with them in their search for safety. The small caravan moved on beneath the mantle of afternoon, and the sun had begun its slow descent in the west, painting the sky in shades of peach and crimson that shimmered across the remaining puddles in the road, a fleeting moment of beauty. Lysander's wagon felt smaller now, heavier under the weight of 5 souls, each carrying their own story, yet that weight created a strange center of gravity, a fragile thread of unity that the young driver could feel with every jolt of the wheels. He glanced at Lord Valerius. The wounded knight lay in silence, pain etched in the tightness of his brow. Still, his breathing was steady, a sign the fever hadn't fully claimed him, and a quiet relief rested over them all. It was a new burden for Lysander, a nobleman in hiding, a man whose life mattered deeply to rival lords. Gautier murmured about the dangers ahead. The hunt for a knight of such rank would be fierce and relentless, and their small, anonymous caravan could easily become a target for mercenary soldiers. The air smelled of sweat and weariness, mixed with the sharp herbs used on Valerius's wound, a scent of reality that left no room for relaxation. Isabel had taken the baby from her lap and rocked the child with a soft, melancholy song. The gentle tune folded itself into the rhythmic sounds of the wagon, acting as a balm on everyone's nerves. She showed surprising tenderness toward Lord Valerius, insisting he drink a thin broth she'd made with the last of her provisions. Her hand pressed a damp cloth to his fevered forehead, a small act of mercy he accepted with a silent nod of gratitude. A little historical note: sanctuary in monasteries was a well-established medieval rite. Church law, in theory, outranked secular law. Anyone persecuted could seek shelter so long as they could support themselves. But escorting a wounded noble to a monastery placed Lysander and his companions inside a political dispute. To secular lords, it would be considered betrayal, and militias wouldn't hesitate to intercept them. Emile, the peasant, had become the sharpest pair of eyes in the group. Using his knowledge of the land, he tracked subtle warnings: a broken branch that hadn't fallen naturally, a hoofprint that wasn't Danton's, or an uncanny silence among the birds. His constant scanning of the ground and forest edge contrasted with Gautier's worry about trade routes and money. Every time Emile halted the wagon to inspect a rut in the road, his deep breath carried the weight of shared responsibility and gave Lysander a tiny moment of rest. As for Lysander, he devoted himself to keeping Danton healthy, easing the wagon on every incline, letting the horse drink, feeding him enough to bear the heavier load. He rubbed Danton's muzzle, feeling the warm velvet of his skin, whispering encouragement. The horse was not a tool. He was the living engine of their survival, the silent hero of the road. Neglecting him would mean disaster. Gautier, now with a blanket draped over his head to block the evening sun, explained what he believed was the safest route: follow the streams and lesser-known paths, avoiding the main road, where patrols and bounty hunters would be most likely. He spoke of an old abandoned mill, a hidden shelter known only to seasoned travelers and the less lawful kind. The idea added a hint of adventure to the monotony of the march. The new path was narrower, covered in thick vegetation. forcing Emil to walk ahead and clear the way, using his staff to push aside shrubs and test the ground. The tapping of his staff and the rustle of branches against the wagon became the new rhythm. A wilder, less predictable soundscape than the open road. The earth shifted to a reddish, sandy hue, and the smell of damp clay rose under their wheels. In a moment of painful lucidity, Lord Valerius managed to whisper the name of the monastery, Abbey of Saint-Félix de Raimond, austere architecture, a bastion of neutrality amidst feudal chaos. Then, with trembling hands, he offered Lysander a small ring of solid silver, payment and promise, a gesture of noble gratitude. Lysander took it reluctantly, feeling the cold heaviness of the metal in his palm. Accepting Valerius's ring marked a quiet turning point. Lysander was no longer just a messenger. He had become a guardian, bound to the knight's fate. He placed the ring in his pouch beside the parchment he'd sworn to deliver. Two precious burdens now rested together, the invisible weight guiding his life. Gautier used the slow hours to mend a small tear in his wool cloak, stitching with an ivory needle and hemp thread, a small, meticulous task to keep fear at bay. He told Lysander that maintaining one's belongings was a matter of survival. Every tool lost was a danger gained. The young driver tucked this lesson into memory. The scent of the river arrived before the river itself, cool, fresh, threaded with algae and swift-moving water. A soft, wet breeze brushed their tired faces. Lysander imagined the moment they would stop at its banks, wash their faces, drink clean water, and breathe easier. The low murmur of running water was a peaceful melody that drowned out the rustling threats of the forest. Ahead, carved into a tree, they spotted a peculiar mark, a cross with a horizontal slash. Gautier explained that monks and pilgrims used such symbols as a secret map, pointing the way to shelters and springs, a hidden network of protection for strangers of the road. Serenity settled over the wagon, born of exhaustion and the hypnotic movement beneath them. Lysander looked up at the sky, deepening orange melting into dark green treetops and the cool blue of lengthening shadows. He felt the warm blanket on his shoulders and the solid weight of the silver ring in his pouch, sensations that defined his world for the moment. He stopped the wagon at the crest of a gentle hill. Below, the valley stretched wide under the slanting golden light of sunset, open fields, scattered groves, and in the distance, the abandoned mill. A lonely stone structure, sturdy and still standing. Just seeing it felt like relief, almost joy. The wind rustled through the treetops, whispering that rest was near. The children's presence was a break against despair. Isabel told them soft stories of rabbits, of fairy towers, her voice low but full of imagination. A child's laughter fluttered into the evening air, bright and weightless, cutting through the heavy seriousness of their mission. Lysander found himself smiling. Gautier suggested they gather dry branches before nightfall, a necessary precaution for a small fire at the mill. Not only for cooking and warmth, but to keep wild animals and symbolically dark spirits of the night away. Emil agreed, and the two men stepped off the wagon, their careful footsteps releasing the scent of earth and wood. The lessons of the previous night had taught Lysander that fire was more than warmth. It was a psychological shield against darkness, a human hearth where fear and stories mixed, where strangers became companions. He watched Gautier and Emile work together, the coordinated movements of men who had been strangers yesterday and brothers today, and felt a quiet satisfaction at the unity he had unknowingly set in motion. The rough texture of dry branches in his hands brought a simple, grounding sense of usefulness. Lord Valerius coughed weakly and gestured for Lysander to come closer. With a rough, strained voice, the knight warned him of a danger particular to that region: mercenaries who disguised themselves in stolen patrol uniforms to trick travelers. A small reminder of the cunning and treachery that haunted medieval roads. He told Lysander never to stop the cart for strangers, even if they appeared to be the law. The lesson was clear: survival required suspicion. A small historical note: medieval patrols were fragmented and unreliable, often controlled by local lords who rarely cared for travelers who weren't their subjects. The absence of real security left space for thieves and former soldiers to thrive. Traveling alone was either an act of bravery or sheer necessity. The sun had already fallen, and dusk swept rapidly across the land, stretching long blue shadows over the road. The cold returned with the dark, sinking into their clothes, and Lysander pulled his wool cloak tight. He leaned closer to the others, sharing body heat the way travelers always had. The warm breath of daylight gave way to the scent of cold earth and damp air, a promise that the long night's vigilance was about to begin. They resumed their final steps toward the mill. Danton quickened his pace, as if he sensed rest waiting ahead. The river sounded louder now, a steady murmur of running water, promising safety and life. Lysander felt the wagon's vibration through his legs, the familiar rhythm of travel, the only constant in a world of uncertainties. When they reached the mill, the old stone structure looked like a small fortress of peace: thick walls, worn roof tiles, and a single large room, just enough shelter from the elements and the watchful eyes of the road. Gautier and Emile worked quickly to pull the wagon inside, hiding it completely from sight. Safety, however temporary, took shape in stone. Isabelle and the children settled in a corner. She lit a small fire, and soon the smell of wood smoke and thin broth filled the cold air, a humble scent of comfort and a borrowed sense of home. Lysander sat beside Lord Valerius and watched the flames. Their warm light flickered across the knight's eyes, turning the moment into a quiet island of peace in a turbulent day. The silver ring still rested in Lysander's pouch, and he realized their little caravan had become its own tiny kingdom, bound not by walls or banners, but by hope. Loyalty and solidarity had replaced noble titles. On medieval roads, courage wasn't only measured by physical strength, but by the willingness to trust strangers with your life. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the gentle sounds of night soak into him, the soft crackle of the fire, the low murmurs of Gautier and Emile as they took turns keeping watch outside, the quiet breathing of the children. It was a symphony of survival, a reminder that peace could exist, even here, even now. The last thing Lysander noticed before sleep claimed him was the reflection of stars shining through a gap in the mill's roof. A blanket of distant lights watched over the little caravan. He felt small, but not alone, one tiny piece of the vast medieval world, protected by unity and duty. He rested his head against the wagon's rough wooden side, feeling the cold grain under his cheek and the weight of his journey in his bones. Serenity deepened, and the safe darkness of the mill welcomed him. The steady breathing of his companions was the last sound he heard, a soft melody of protection that carried him gently into sleep. Lysander's awakening was slow and gentle, stirred not by alarms or urgency, but by the faint crackle of the fire and the warm smell of roasted barley coffee rising from a small iron pot where Isabelle prepared breakfast. Morning light slipped through the gaps in the old mill walls, painting the stone interior with a pale grey glow and revealing thin beams of dust drifting quietly in the air, an ethereal reminder that night had finally surrendered to day. He felt the rough texture of the wagon wood beneath his head and the chill of the stone floor brushing his shoulder, physical signs of where he had slept and of the dangers he had endured. The camp moved with quiet purpose. Gautier and Émile inspected the wagon and Danton with meticulous care, checking the axle for cracks, examining the horse's hooves, tightening ropes and straps. Preventive maintenance was more than a chore on medieval roads. It was a matter of survival. A small historical curiosity, mills like this one, whether powered by water or wind, were often the only stone buildings in rural regions. Their thick walls and solid design made them rare safe havens, stronger and more secure than any wooden hut or traveller's shelter. The morning's atmosphere was one of careful calm. Soft voices murmured. The fire snapped gently. Outside, the river offered a constant liquid whisper. The scent of barley coffee and hard bread filled the mill, a humble breakfast, but nourishing enough to restore energy after a long, uncertain night. Lysander wrapped his cold hands around a warm iron cup and felt its comfort settle deep into his bones. Lord Valerius was awake. His fever had eased slightly, leaving him pale but steady. He managed to drink and thanked Isabel with a quiet nod, his dignity still intact, even as pain drained his strength. His presence, once a dangerous burden, had become the very purpose of their journey. Every path they chose now pointed toward the Abbey of Saint-Félix de Raimond, and their individual destinies had stitched themselves into a single thread. Lysander checked the knight's bandage and touched his forehead. Valerius met his gaze with tired but sharp eyes. In a low voice, he offered a brief lesson in the military geography of the region, explaining choke points, hidden routes, and the castles they needed to avoid. The young traveller listened closely. This was knowledge worth more than gold, the wisdom of a man who understood how power shaped danger. The moment of departure drew near, and Lysander felt determination replace fear. He brushed Danton's velvety muzzle, whispering encouragement while tightening straps and adjusting the harness. The journey ahead would be longer, harder, and full of detours, but the horse was their lifeline, and he cared for him as such. Gautier and Émile worked efficiently, the mercenary mind of a trader balancing supplies, the strength of a farmer securing cargo so the wagon wouldn't sway on uneven ground. The urgency of the road had turned them into a seamless team. Before leaving, Émile and Gautier stepped outside to make sure the area was clear. Only then did Lysander lead the wagon back into the daylight. The wheels rolled softly over dry leaves and dirt. They took the hidden trail that followed the river, slower, rougher, but safer, protected by vegetation and distance from the main road. Sunlight filtered through branches, scattering patches of gold and shadow along the ground. Leaves brushed the sides of the wagon. The air was heavy with the smell of damp earth, moss, and forest decay, a deep, natural perfume of wilderness. Lysander felt cool leaves graze his cheek, the brief, gentle touch, reminding him of how close the world was around them. Valerius watched him quietly with eyes that weighed character as much as direction. In a faint voice, he asked about Lysander's original mission. The young man, shy and honest, explained about the parchment, the sick relative, and the duty that had set him on the road. The knight smiled, a thin, respectful smile of someone who understood honor. During a brief pause, Gautier warned Lysander never to reveal the silver ring Valerius had given him. A piece of metal that valuable was not a blessing on the road. It was bait for thieves and mercenary patrols who hunted noble fugitives. Anonymity, he reminded, was the best armor a traveler could wear. Lysander tucked the ring deeper into his pouch, beside the precious parchment. The riverside path was beautiful. The constant sound of water sliding over stones softened the tension in their minds. Émile pointed out small fish in the shallows and explained how he could catch them with a simple net to stretch their food supply. For medieval travelers, nature was pantry, danger, shelter, and teacher all at once. The wagon moved slowly, Isabel sang softly to the children, a lullaby from the countryside, turning fear into quiet normality. Danton marched with steady steps, head low, breath warm. The smell of his sweat and fur carried the scent of hard work and loyalty, and Lysander felt grateful for him in a way words could not express. Time passed in a peaceful rhythm of wheels, water, and wind. Somewhere ahead, a bell rang, distant and melancholy. Maybe a small chapel or an isolated hermitage. Bells in medieval life were more than sound. They were messages, marking hours, calling for worship, warning of fire, invasion, or strangers on the road. Hearing it now offered a strange comfort. Civilization still existed, even in the wildest corners of the forest. Gautier pointed upward. A large black bird, sleek feathers, slow circles, glided above them. A raven. On the road, ravens were omens. They meant death nearby or trouble ahead. Travelers learned to respect the signs of nature, and Gautier shared a quiet story of a man who ignored them and paid dearly for it. They stopped briefly to stretch their legs and refill water skins. The river's water touched Lysander's skin like cool velvet, washing away dust and fatigue. Emile helped Valerius drink, gently supporting the knight's head, a scene of silent compassion that erased social rank and left only human need. Isabel used the moment to comb her daughter's hair with a small bone comb. The soft rasp of the teeth against the child's curls was a tiny, intimate sound, motherhood surviving in the midst of fear. Lysander watched them with a quiet sense of peace. Wildflowers perfumed the air with sweet, fleeting scent. He breathed deeply, storing the calm inside himself like a tiny reserve of strength. Soon, the wagon moved again. The road was long, but solidarity made it bearable. Lysander felt stronger, no longer a solitary messenger, but the guardian of a small, vulnerable kingdom of souls. Gautier and Emile sat on either side, eyes scanning the forest, two human shields protecting everyone within. Their silhouettes were symbols of courage, the kind only ordinary people carry in extraordinary times. Lysander smiled softly and pulled the reins. Not fast, just steady. The journey was no longer a flight, but a commitment. Serenity returned, not because danger was gone, but because purpose had replaced fear. The wagon rolled forward along the river, wheels whispering across damp earth, a sound of promise and hope. The monastery was still far, but with Danton's strength and their shared vigilance, arrival was only a matter of time. Lysander sat straighter, his back firm against the wagon's plank. The forest's scent and the river's song blended into a gentle mantra that wrapped around him. The morning sun rose higher, warming their shoulders, dissolving the last traces of night. Above them, the sky stretched wide and calm, a quiet blue reassurance that not all of the world was haunted by danger. And in that moment, Lysander understood something simple and profound. True courage wasn't traveling alone. It was accepting the weight of others, and knowing they accepted yours. The small caravan slipped into the next valley, leaving only the soft wheel tracks behind. Danton kept his slow, determined rhythm, and the road carried them onward, to safety, to duty, to hope. Travel with them now, quietly, feeling the calm of movement, the unity of strangers, and the steady peace of a wagon guided by courage. The caravan left the safety of the abandoned mill and continued along the narrow path beside the river. The change in scenery forced an even slower, more cautious rhythm. The ground was softer now, covered in moss and fallen leaves, muffling the sound of Danton's hooves and the wagon wheels. It was a welcome advantage for stealth, yet it required Lysander's constant attention to avoid sinking into the riverbank. The air smelled of running water and damp vegetation, a fresh, wild scent that felt like the very breath of the untamed medieval world. The young driver felt the cool, moist morning air settle on his skin, sharpening his senses. The twisting trail allowed almost no view of what lay ahead, increasing the chance of surprises. Gautier and Emile took turns walking ahead of the wagon, pushing branches aside and testing the ground before each step. Their careful footfalls became the only steady sound, joined by the soft murmur of the river, a slow, strategic rhythm meant to preserve energy and safety. Lord Valerius was more alert now. The pain had eased, and his mind was sharper. He used the quiet to teach Lysander simple but valuable techniques of stealth and tracking, how to cross the river in certain places to break a trail, how to cover wagon marks in soft soil, and how to read the ground for signs of pursuit. It was a brief lesson in guerrilla survival, practical knowledge that turned a simple wagon into a moving ghost on the medieval landscape. A small curiosity of rural life revealed itself: the absence of reliable bridges. The river was obstacle and guide at once. They crossed at a shallow stretch where Emile waded in, feeling the current tug at his legs as he guided Danton across. Together they coaxed the wagon over the stones, water splashing against wood and wheels. The smell of churned mud and riverbank moss filled the air, a vivid reminder of how physical survival was. Isabelle stayed quiet in the wagon, eyes fixed on the children and their few belongings. In a soft voice, she told Gautier about an old custom, leaving a small piece of bread on the riverbank as an offering to the spirits of the water, asking for safe passage. It was part superstition, part prayer, faith woven into survival. Gautier nodded respectfully. The road had room for many beliefs. Lysander felt the weight of Valerius's silver ring tucked deep inside his pouch. The contrast between the life he'd had, a humble messenger, and the role he now carried, protector of a noble fugitive, made him aware of how quickly identity could shift on the road. He focused on the feel of the reins, adjusting the wagon with small, precise motions. In a landscape like this, driving a wagon wasn't merely travel, it was a delicate, life-saving dance. After the crossing, Gautier told a short, rough-voiced story about a merchant he once knew who lost everything by flaunting his wealth. Ostentation on the road invited disaster. Prudence meant survival. The warning struck deeper now, after his own recent loss. As the sun climbed, the forest air grew warmer and heavier, yet the scent of pine and damp earth lingered under the heat. Lysander felt Danton's body radiating warmth, a steady, living furnace at the heart of their journey. The young man's thoughts drifted toward the parchment in his pouch and the promise that had brought him here. That original mission remained his guiding light, even as new responsibilities reshaped his fate. What had begun as a solitary task had become a shared cause. He glanced at his companions, each carrying their own burden, and felt the strength of their unity. The wagon moved slowly, but its pace was steady, and steadiness meant survival. A small historical reflection. The mill they had left behind was likely a windmill, built on open land to capture the strongest gusts. Windmills were essential where rivers were weak, a quiet sign of medieval engineering. Their isolated placement also kept them safe from thieves. Strong walls and quiet distance were a kind of hidden fortress. Emile pointed out wild mushrooms growing at the base of a great oak. They were edible, soft and spongy beneath his fingers, a food source known to rural families in times of scarcity. The earth itself fed them if one knew how to read it. A distant, sharp cry sliced through the quiet, a hunting falcon circling high above them. Valerius, more lucid now, said falcons were often used by nobles and could mean hunting parties or patrols nearby. Another reason to stay hidden along the river. Tension pulsed through the group in small, invisible waves, never overwhelming, always present. Lysander kept his attention on the rhythm of Danton's steps. That sound had become a heartbeat of safety, a counterweight to uncertainty. Isabel's calm was a silent anchor. Her presence soothed the children and steadied the men. Courage, Lysander realized, came in many shapes, and her quiet strength was as vital as any sword. During a brief pause, Gautier greased the wagon axles. The dark, oily substance coated his fingers as he worked with careful precision. Less squeaking meant less noise, an invisible layer of protection. Even the smell, metal and warm oil, felt like a defense against the world. Lysander studied the forest, the layered greens of oak and willow, the shifting patterns of light. A soft breeze brushed his face, waking his senses and cutting through the weight of concentration. He understood now that medieval life was a constant negotiation between necessity and danger, hope and caution. The wagon was more than wood and wheels. It was a fragile balance of survival and trust. Still, the movement continued. The river guided them forward, quiet, cold, and alive. Every mile carried them away from danger and toward the sanctuary of Saint-Félix de Raymond. The reins felt warm and worn beneath his fingers. Danton's steady steps hummed with promise. The caravan moved as one, slow, silent, determined. Above them, sunlight filtered through the branches in thin gold ribbons. Warmth touched Lysander's face, and he allowed himself to imagine safety, a destination beyond fear, beyond the endless trees. He smiled faintly, accepting both the burden and the beauty of companionship. Serenity returned, not because danger had vanished, but because they were no longer facing it alone. The wagon rolled forward, silent and steady, guided by purpose, trust, and the quiet promise of a refuge waiting somewhere ahead. Let the rhythm of Danton's hooves and the soft whisper of the river carry you now, just as they carried the little caravan deeper into the unknown. The morning sun had climbed to its highest point, and golden shafts of light filtered through Sylvangard's dense canopy, casting a constant play of moving shadow and brightness across the forest floor. A hypnotic, soothing effect. The caravan had left the river's edge and entered a drier, more wooded stretch of trail, where the scent of pine and sun-warmed earth grew stronger and the water's murmur gave way to a deep, heavy silence, one that demanded even sharper vigilance from Lysander and his companions. His thoughts drew inward to a single object, the rolled, seal-stamped parchment tucked in his pouch, the original cargo and the quiet engine of his entire journey. In a brief rest, he drew it out, feeling the rough, dry grain of aged goatskin and the cool hardness of the wax seal. Its weight in his hands felt symbolic, duty and honor made tangible. That simple object was the small story of his fidelity, a thread linking the world he'd left behind to the uncertain destination ahead. He studied the seal, dark wax bearing the intricate impression of a little-known family crest. In the Middle Ages, such craftsmanship was the only guarantee that a document was genuine, a detail of trust in a world without universal law. The sight of it carried him away from the road's tension and into the quiet of his promise. He recalled the frail voice of the sick relative who had entrusted it to him, an elder with discreet wisdom and few words. The tale of that vow was a bond of blood and duty propelling him forward, a subtle contrast between the simplicity of his original task and the layered danger he now faced in protecting a wounded nobleman. The chill, unyielding feel of the wax against his fingers grounded him in the seriousness of his mission. Watching from a short distance, Lord Valerius noticed the tenderness with which Lysander handled the parchment. In a somewhat stronger voice, he spoke of the importance of sealed documents. An authentic piece of history, carrying letters and sealed orders, was a dangerous profession. Their contents were often vital to politics or war, and messengers were frequent targets of ambush, so that secrets could be stolen or destroyed. The knight laid out the risks Lysander had taken from the beginning, risks he'd shouldered alone before meeting the caravan, and offered a quiet respect for the young man's solitary courage. If they were captured, Valerius warned, Lysander's parchment would interest their enemies. Any scrap that revealed a family matter or land transaction could become a weapon. Lysander put the parchment away and felt a small warmth of belonging. It was his anchor now, and guarding it mattered as much as guarding Valerius himself. He focused on the dry, rhythmic thud of Danton's hooves along the earthen path, the very sound of continuity and forward motion, a cadence of hope inside the forest. Walking beside the wagon, Gautier remarked on the texture of the soil, rich with clay. He explained that such ground was excellent for pottery and tiles, which likely meant the next village was a craft center. Practical and precise, the merchant's eye turned the landscape into an economic map. A faint scent on the breeze, damp clay and the subtle smoke of a kiln confirmed Gautier's prediction, adding a fresh layer of sensation to the road. The caravan prepared to approach human settlement, a place of danger and opportunity in equal measure, where vigilance would give way to the need for quiet anonymity among strangers. Isabel took the moment to check the children's temperature, her palm resting on tiny foreheads, a simple, intimate gesture that defined her mission within the caravan. Their safety and well-being were the top priority, and the wagon's steady movement kept them calm, turning the rolling boards beneath them into a traveling cradle. Emile pointed out a spring bubbling from a rock veiled in deep green moss, a sign of purity and abundance. They stopped to refill their water skins, and Lysander felt the cool, velvety freshness slide down his throat, immense relief from the noon heat. The water's bright rush was a melody of life that eased every nerve. He used the pause to rub Danton's neck, feeling the thick coat, the heat of working muscle. The touch reconnected him to his faithful partner. More than a beast of burden, the horse was the silent ally of the mission, and his well-being held the caravan's survival in the balance. A historical note from daily medieval life. Wax seals on documents were everywhere, and forging them could mean death. Often, the seal itself carried more weight than the letter's content, since it embodied the sender's authority and authenticity, making Lysander's parchment a discreet instrument of power. Valerius watched them all with quiet approval, gratitude plain on his pale face. He understood that the young man's loyalty and courage were rarer and more valuable than gold or title, and that the union of this unlikely group was the only force capable of resisting the road's violence and disorder. Lysander felt the sun's warmth on his wool cloak and, with it, a sense of belonging to this improbable circle, a road-born family bound by adversity. He wasn't alone anymore. He was the center of a small ring of hope, and the parchment in his pouch had become the silent emblem of the duty that, without intending to, had gathered them together. The caravan began moving again, and the wagon rolled slowly toward the artisan village. The smell of wood smoke and baked clay grew stronger, an unmistakable sign of nearby human settlement. Lysander adjusted the reins, feeling the familiar worn leather against his palms, and focused on keeping a gentle, steady pace, the rhythm of caution. To keep them safe, Gautier draped a dark blanket over Lord Valerius, hiding his armor and his noble bearing. In a village, wealth or status was an invitation to danger. They needed to look like nothing more than a small group of traveling peasants, anonymous, unremarkable, forgettable. Isabel watched the road ahead with sharp, steady eyes, searching for signs of patrols or armed men. Her strength wasn't the strength of battle. It was the unwavering determination to protect her children and the wounded knight in their care. A quiet, feminine courage, deeply rooted and resolute. Emile warned Lysander about a patch of loose gravel and scattered stones up ahead, a treacherous stretch that could throw the wagon off balance if crossed carelessly. The young driver slowed Danton's pace, feeling the wheels shudder and shift beneath the weight of their passengers. The sensation was fragile and unsettling, demanding careful, precise control. The children's soft questions, murmured gently to their mother, were a tender contrast to the tension. That small melody of normality felt like a blessing. Lysander thought of his destination, the promise in his parchment, the distant abbey, and the sense that each slow step carried them closer to safety. A small historical truth. Medieval artisan villages were hubs of trade and production. They were vibrant with craftsmen, merchants, and travelers, which made them lively and, paradoxically, dangerous. Where there was industry, there were thieves, spies, and impostors. Discretion was the only real armor in such places. The young guide felt the warm sun on his back and the presence of his companions beside him. Solidarity had become a heat stronger than sunlight. He was no longer the lone traveler. He was the leader of a road-born family, and the responsibility gave him strength he hadn't known he possessed. His thoughts deepened. Courage on the road wasn't only facing the obvious threats, it was sustaining hope, protecting trust and moving forward despite uncertainty. That quiet faith was the heart of medieval life. He touched the pouch where the parchment rested. Small, but powerful. The spark that had begun this journey, the proof of his honor and the reason these people had gathered around him. The image of the distant abbey glowed in his mind like a beacon, a place where all their stories would finally meet. Lysander smiled faintly to himself, an expression of acceptance and belonging, and guided Danton onward with a gentle hand. The steady rhythm of hooves blended with the soft murmur of the forest, a peaceful music leading the caravan toward the light of their destination. The caravan drew close to the small artisan village of Mirecourt, and the narrative widened into a moment of contact with the outside world, a scene of greater risk and the need for absolute discretion. The scent of charcoal smoke and hot metal took over the air, blended with the smell of leather and grain, the aroma of a working community, alive and busy. Lysander felt tension rise in his shoulders. Life in a village, no matter how small, carried a complexity that the forest never did. Watchful eyes, curious whispers, and judgments silently sharpened beneath the surface. He guided the wagon down a secondary path, following Emile's advice. The peasant had lived in places like this, and he knew too well. Avoid the main road, avoid the tax collectors, avoid the guards. They stopped at the edge of the village, hidden in a small grove of pale birch trees. Their smooth white bark caught the afternoon light like silent lanterns, a striking contrast to the dark forest behind them. The quiet of that little grove became a tactical pause before stepping into the noise of civilization. Gautier climbed down, wrapped himself in a plain wool cloak, and took on the role of scout and trader. He carried only a small pouch of coins, just enough to buy food and, more importantly, to gather news. He was the thread that tied the caravan to the civilized world, and his greatest talent was the ability to blend in and hide his true wealth. A tiny tale of merchant survival. A small historical truth. In places like Mirecourt, markets and fair days were the beating heart of medieval economy. People traded more than goods. They traded rumors, alliances, secrets. Coins changed value from region to region, and Gautier's knowledge of currencies and barter was a rare skill, Without him, the caravan had no logistics, no supply chain, no access to information. Lysander waited with the wagon beneath the birches, while Isabel and Emile tended to Lord Valerius. The Camponesa prepared a poultice of herbs she had gathered on the road. The smell was earthy, sharp and hopeful. The fever had steadied. Life held on. Lysander felt the silver ring of Valerius pressing in his pouch, cold, heavy, and completely out of place in such humble surroundings. In the Middle Ages, power could be reduced to a single hidden object, and safety was found among the poor and the invisible. He focused on the knight's breathing, shallow but steady. As long as that breath continued, the vow stood firm. Emile sat on the ground and sharpened his work knife, the metallic scrape of steel on stone repeating like a calm, steady heartbeat. He taught Lysander a peasant trick, to make the forest speak, using bird calls and animal sounds to warn each other secretly. A quiet language of survival. The young driver practiced the sounds in a whisper, feeling the shape of them in his throat. Every skill mattered now. The wagon was a moving union of different worlds, the merchant's cunning, the peasant's strength, the noble's strategy, a traveling alliance of unlikely souls. The ground smelled of damp soil and dry leaves, blending with the breeze that carried the scent of the village. Danton rested peacefully, and Lysander brushed the horse's neck. The bond between them was silent and absolute, the true engine of their journey. Time moved slowly. Waiting was its own form of tension. Lysander inspected the wagon's axles, running his hands along the wood and iron, ensuring everything was tight and ready. If danger came, they would need to leave quickly. The touch of cold wood and rough metal grounded his thoughts and kept impatience away. Isabel shared a small tale of faith. Villagers wore wooden amulets and dried herbs to protect their families and animals from illness and bad omens. She offered Lysander a sprig of rosemary, its sharp, clean scent a symbol of protection and purification. He accepted it with quiet respect, placing it in his pouch alongside the parchment and the silver ring. A sacred herb, a noble seal, a humble promise. All resting together, symbols of the strange unity their journey had created. Gautier finally returned, carrying a sack of supplies, fresh bread, cheap wine, dried meat. He reported that Mirecourt was calm, but there were rumors. A band of southern mercenaries had passed recently, brutal men loyal to the rival baron hunting Valerius. That news turned the quiet grove into a place of urgency. The merchant had also managed to buy a small vial of expensive healing salve, rare herbs, prepared by an apothecary. The smell was sweet, sharp, and hopeful. It promised relief, and perhaps a bit more strength for the wounded knight. Lysander broke the warm bread, tasted the rough wine, and felt something close to gratitude. Valerius slept more peacefully than before. The plan, the unity, the caution, everything was working. They prepared to move again under the golden light of late afternoon. Now the journey became a strategic retreat, guided by intelligence, strengthened by solidarity. Lysander knew the danger was close, but he also knew that courage was no longer his alone. They were a single road-bound family, protected by each other and driven by a shared hope for the sanctuary of the abbey. And so they rolled forward, slowly, quietly, toward safety. Lysander fell into the new rhythm of the journey, aware that Mirecourt and its dangers were now behind them, but the mercenaries loyal to Valerius's rival baron might very well be waiting ahead. The warm scent of dirt and dry grass thickened in the evening air. It was the smell that warned travelers of nightfall, a moment when visibility shrank, shadows multiplied, and every risk doubled. They needed shelter before darkness fully settled. The wagon's wheels made only a soft murmur, Gautier's careful work with grease and oil had turned the wooden frame and iron bolts into a whisper, blending with the sigh of wind along the trees. Lysander used the trick Emile had taught him, making the forest speak. A subtle call of a night bird, a click of his tongue, or a soft whistle signaled to the peasant walking ahead. It was a secret language, invisible and efficient, and it kept everyone safer. Lord Valerius, clearer of mind thanks to Isabel's care and Gautier's healing salve, continued to strengthen Lysander's understanding of the road. He explained how a wagon could become a shield in narrow paths, blocking a mounted charge or forcing enemies into a bottleneck. A small tactical lesson, simple, practical, and priceless. Gautier, carrying the weight of travelling with a hunted noble, shared his own knowledge, the tangled web of tolls and fees across medieval estates. He described how, in times of war, men with swords stood at bridges and crossroads, demanding coins and asking too many questions. In such places, poverty was safety and anonymity was armour. It was a reminder that the hidden forest path was not only slower, it was necessary. Lysander tightened his grip on the reins. The leather felt warm and pliable in his hands, and the strain of concentration warmed his face. His duty was simple: keep Danton steady, keep everyone moving, protect the people behind him. He glanced at Isabel and the children, their small faces watching the fading light with quiet trust. That trust was the force that pushed him forward. His mission, once just a personal promise tied to a single parchment, had become something else. The life of Valerius meant safety for the peasants. The survival of the caravan meant redemption for Gautier. Their fates were now braided together, and Lysander was the knot that held them. The sun dipped low, shadows stretching like pale ghosts across the forest floor. A faint smell of smoke drifted through the trees, perhaps a distant cottage, perhaps a camp. Either could mean danger, and silence spread across the caravan like a warning. Emile suddenly ran back through the ferns, breath sharp, eyes wide. In a hushed voice, he told them what he had seen. A small group of hard-faced riders, cloaked in dark clothes, no banners, no colours. Mercenaries or bandits pretending not to be. They were camping near a bridge ahead, blocking the path south. Lysander's heart jumped. He pulled the reins hard, and Danton stopped with a quick jolt, the wheels grinding softly across the dirt. Valerius had been right. Gautier had been right. The danger was real and very close. They gathered in a tight circle, speaking in low, urgent voices. Valerius, weak but razor-minded, advised abandoning the wagon and moving on foot beneath the trees, crossing the river to lose their trail. It was a soldier's solution, efficient, tactical, brutal. But Gautier shook his head. The wagon was their only means of carrying Valerius and the children. On foot, they wouldn't last the night. Better to take a longer, slower detour through the thickest part of the forest. Risky, yes, but it kept them together. Isabel agreed. The children couldn't survive a night trek in the cold. Lysander made the decision. His voice was quiet but firm. They would not abandon Danton, nor the wagon. They would take the long path and stay together. He rested his hand on Danton's shoulder, feeling the warm coat of the horse beneath his palm. A silent vow, a promise between companions. Emile went to work immediately, breaking branches and piling foliage over the sides of the wagon, a quick camouflage to blur its outline. The smell of green sap and broken wood filled the air. A small act of peasant cleverness, but a powerful gift to the caravan. Lysander helped, feeling the rough leaves brush his fingers. The forest, once a place of fear, became their shield. They began to back away from the road, deeper into the woods. The wagon creaked softly through the undergrowth, moving like a ghost between the trees. Every step was slow, deliberate, cautious. Night was coming, danger was close, and yet, together, they moved forward. toward the abbey, toward sanctuary, toward hope. The caravan pushed deeper into the thick forest, and the journey slowed to a painful crawl, a march of inches through tangled undergrowth and uneven ground. The sun had vanished completely, leaving the woods wrapped in near-total darkness, eased only by the faint flickering glow of a small oil lantern Lysander had tied beneath the back of the wagon, its flame carefully hidden from view. He could smell damp earth mixed with moss, and he felt branches brushing against his wool cloak with every step, a constant reminder of the forest's quiet hostility. The dominant sound was silence. Heavy, suffocating, absolute. Only the soft creak of wood, the muted sigh of wheels forcing their way over roots, and Danton's tired breathing broke the stillness. The enforced quiet turned into a kind of contemplation. They were too exhausted to speak and too afraid to make noise. They finally stopped in a small clearing, just a circle of packed dirt beneath the protective canopy of ancient oaks. Lysander made the choice no medieval traveler ever wanted to make. No fire, no flame, no smoke, no spark. A measure of safety bought at the price of comfort. The night cold arrived instantly, sharp, merciless, everyone huddled close, sharing body warmth, a small and intimate act of survival. Valerius, still wounded but clear-minded, spoke in a low, hoarse whisper, training Gautier and Emile in the discipline of silent watchkeeping. He explained the idea of a quiet guard, where the only weapons were sharpened hearing and eyes tuned to darkness. It was a miniature lesson in passive defense. Invisibility was stronger than steel. Lysander sat with his back against a wagon wheel, feeling the rough, cold wood pressing into his shoulders. He pulled the sealed parchment from his bag, and under the dim lantern glow, he looked at it the way one looks at a compass in a storm. It was his ritual of reassurance, a quiet return to the promise that started it all. Inside the wagon, Isabel and the children slept in a small nest of blankets and cloaks. Their gentle, steady breathing sounded like a lullaby, soft, warm, peaceful, a fragile contrast to the fear that lay in the darkness around them. Lysander could smell the sweet, innocent scent of the sleeping children, a reminder of everything worth protecting. A soft, historical thought drifted through his mind. In medieval times, darkness wasn't just the absence of light. It was a kingdom of superstition, haunted by tales of spirits, wolves, and unseen horrors. To sit in the cold without a fire took a special kind of courage. Not the courage of swords, but the courage of silence. Gautier stood first watch, a still silhouette holding a makeshift spear, ears tuned to every shift of wind and leaf. He coughed quietly and offered Lysander a small strip of dried meat. A silent gesture of care, simple, human, necessary. The salty, leathery texture of the meat brought Lysander back to full wakefulness, anchoring him to the moment. He chewed slowly, grateful. The caravan was a living body, each person a vital part, each small kindness a stitch that held them together. Alone, they were fragile. Together, they were strong. Emile, preparing for the second watch, shared a superstition from his village. Peasants listened to the hoot of an owl to predict weather and luck for the harvest. The young man could smell earth and hay on Emile's clothing, a scent of farms, work, and simple life, so different from nobles and merchants, yet equally important. The night grew colder. Gautier's heavy blanket across Lysander's shoulders felt like a gift, a shield against the freezing dark. He looked up. The sky was a black velvet field, studded with sharp, distant stars. The sight made him feel small and strangely peaceful. A soft wind whispered through the treetops, a gentle rustling that sounded almost like a lullaby. Lysander let his mind loosen. He welcomed the calm. He had learned that serenity wasn't the absence of fear. It was a shield against it. He closed his eyes a moment, breathing steadily, and let the night hold him. Time felt suspended in the stillness of the dark forest, and that contemplative pause stretched gently, granting the caravan a rare luxury: rest without the weight of constant motion. Lysander had traded places with Emile and now stood guard, his eyes fully adjusted to the darkness. The loudest sound was the slow, steady rhythm of his own breathing, a quiet pulse of life and vigilance. His thoughts drifted toward the distant abbey, Saint-Félix de Raymond, a place he had never seen, yet the beacon guiding his entire journey and the fate of everyone traveling with him. In his mind, the abbey was a sanctuary of stone walls and quiet cloisters, a vision of safety and peace that pushed him to endure the cold and crushing fatigue of the night. Valerius, keeping silent watch nearby, coughed softly and called to Lysander with a whisper. He warned of a faint smell in the air, smoke from wood that wasn't theirs, a different scent, subtle but clear, signaling another camp somewhere in the forest, possibly the mercenaries hunting them. His serious gaze said what words did not. Their survival depended on silence. Lysander caught the scent too, thin, distant, but unmistakable. A warning carried on the night air. A chill crawled up his spine, and adrenaline washed away the heavy fog of exhaustion. He used the owl call Emile had taught him to alert Gautier without speaking a word. The mercer, who had been sleeping, woke instantly, wide-eyed and listening. Lysander's hand tightened around the cold wooden grip of his sword. A small comfort, a last resort. The quiet interlude was over. Any moment could demand sudden flight or defense. Isabel stirred as well, awakened by the silent tension. In a whisper soft as breath, she told Lysander a small story of faith. She believed that the saints who guarded the road guided the steps of the innocent, and that her faith was a shield against evil. The warmth of her conviction was a comfort deeper than anything physical. The caravan did not move. No one spoke. They simply waited, a tight knot of fear and vigilance, while the night crept forward at an agonizing pace. Lysander could smell the forest growing sharper around them, as though even the earth sensed danger. His breaths came shallow, his ears tuned to every rustle, every whisper of leaves. In a barely audible murmur, Gautier shared a contingency plan. If they were discovered, he and Emile would create a distraction, giving Lysander a chance to escape with Valerius and the family. It was an act of quiet sacrifice that pressed deeply into Lysander's heart. He answered with a single silent nod and wrapped the reins tighter in his hand, ready to move Danton at the first sign of trouble. Only the wind spoke, rustling through the treetops, gentle, rhythmic, indifferent. The long vigil stretched on, and Lysander focused on the slow, steady breathing of Danton. The soft sound of the horse felt like an anchor, a reminder that something strong and loyal stood beside him. He looked up at the sky, a deep black dome glittering with stars, sharp and bright in the moonless dark. The sight settled him, easing the tightness in his chest. Serenity returned, not the serenity of peace, but the serenity of acceptance. They were exposed, yes, but united, awake and brave. Somewhere behind the treetops, the first hint of dawn was quietly pushing back the night. Dawn reached the clearing with a slow and redeeming grace. A pale, cold light began to slip between the trees, peeling away the oppressive darkness and revealing the caravan in its tense state of rest. The morning carried a rhythm of caution. The mercenaries that Valerius and Emile had sensed in the night seemed to have moved in another direction, or scattered, but the risk of being tracked lingered in the air. Lysander felt the sharp chill of early morning settling against his skin, yet the scent of damp earth and rising mist promised a new day of marching and quiet vigilance. For the first time, the focus shifted to Isabel. She stepped down from the wagon and went straight to Danton. While the men watched the shadows and planned their defense, she tended to the silent engine of the journey. She rubbed the horse's tired legs with a simple herbal salve, feeling the thick, warm coat beneath her hands. Her eyes held both gratitude and respect, a wordless apology and a gentle thank you to the only creature carrying them forward without complaint. Lysander watched her with quiet admiration. Isabel's strength wasn't sharpened by a sword or molded by strategy. It lived in her ability to nurture, to protect through care. That tenderness was the backbone of their survival, even if no one ever sang songs about it. She hummed a soft, melancholy tune, a peasant song about the earth and its animals, and her voice spread through the clearing like a warm blanket of calm. Even Danton lowered his head, as if soothed by the melody. With daylight on their side, Gautier and Émile searched the edge of the camp for signs of visitors. They found the faint impression of a leather boot pressed into a patch of mud. Someone had come close enough to watch, and left when they found no fire, no voices, no weakness. Their silence had protected them. The tension thickened, but so fez their certainty that they were still being hunted. Émile, guided by his sense of the land, suggested a route that would take them into the mountains. Dense vegetation, steep trails, terrain hostile to mounted pursuers. Harder for them, but nearly impossible for mercenaries on horseback. Lysander agreed immediately. Exhaustion could be endured, capture could not. The warm scent of roasted barley coffee drifted through the clearing, and for a moment, hope smelled like breakfast. He wrapped his hands around the hot iron cup, letting its heat wake his fingers and mind. The bitter, nourishing drink stirred strength back into his body, a small blessing before the climb. Isabel's gaze swept from child to horse to noble. She was the guardian of life. She made Valerius drink the last of the broth and even a sip of the coffee, despite his gentle protests. Her stubborn kindness was the same force that kept her children alive. A universal act of charity that erased the distance between classes. Valerius watched her with deep respect. He whispered a short memory to Lysander and Gautier, a story of a field nurse who once saved his life in battle, a woman of faith and quiet strength. He saw that same courage in Isabel, silent, steady, essential. When it was time to move, Lysander placed his hand on a rock marked with cold, wet clay, the beginning of the mountain trail. The earth felt firm, unforgiving, and full of challenge. Danton's breathing grew heavier, the sound of effort, loyalty, and resilience. Lysander ran a gentle hand along the horse's neck, offering comfort and whispered encouragement. Ahead lay the mountain, the road of hardship and safety, and together they stepped into it. The silent vigil in the clearing stretched on, and the faint smell of smoke Valerius had sensed seemed to fade, or perhaps the wind had simply shifted, carrying the scent of danger away from their hiding place. The relief in Lysander's chest was small but warm, yet the night's lesson about mercenary cunning remained like a stone beneath calm water. Silent, constant, unavoidable. He rested his hand against the rough wood of the wagon, felt the cold morning air flood his lungs, and existed in that thin space between fear and alertness, alive, awake, listening. Time behaved differently in the darkness, longer, slower, stretched thin. Lysander used the quiet hours to replay Gautier's map in his mind, the winding mountain trail, the narrow passes, and the distant safety of the abbey. His simple mission, deliver a sealed parchment, had become something heavier, a duty not only to words sealed in wax, but to the human lives gathered around him, a small story of unexpected guardianship. Emile, keeping the second half of the watch, leaned close and whispered a peasant superstition. They believed that stones with natural holes hung on wagon axles kept evil spirits of the roads away. It was a harmless charm, but comforting in a world where danger was real and magic felt possible. Lysander smiled, faint and tired, understanding that every traveller, noble or poor, searched for protection in the dark. Gautier, wrapped in his cloak, murmured through a dream. A soft, broken sound from a man worn thin by fear and exhaustion. To Lysander, the sound was not weakness, but trust, the mercenary sleep of someone who believed the young guide would keep them safe. His hand brushed against a strip of silk, a remnant of Gautier's lost cargo, now used as a bandage for Valerius's arm. The contrast of soft silk and torn flesh felt like a metaphor for the Middle Ages themselves, beauty and brutality living side by side under the same indifferent sky. The wind moved through the trees in gentle waves, a low, constant whisper like a lullaby written for leaves and moonlight. Danton slept peacefully, his breaths deep and steady, proof that the night had restored his strength. Lysander's thoughts drifted to Saint-Fély-de-Raymond, the abbey of stone and silence, a place he had never seen yet imagined perfectly. Walls thick enough to hold out chaos, prayers strong enough to hold back violence, a refuge, a promise, a destination. Valerius stirred, coughed, and beckoned Lysander closer. In a whisper, he reminded him that at first light they must wipe out every wheel mark in the mud before climbing to higher ground. A small, tactical detail, but essential for disappearing. Lysander nodded, absorbing the night's knowledge like water into dry earth. In his pocket, the sprig of rosemary Isabel had given him released its clean, sharp scent. A charm, a blessing, a protector against fear and shadows. Isabel woke briefly, pressed her palm to her children's foreheads, and whispered to Lysander that she had dreamt of a river of clear water. A sign, she believed, that safety waited somewhere along the mountain. Her faith warmed him more than the cloak on his shoulders. Slowly, the cold of the night began to retreat. A thin, grey-silver glow gathered on the horizon. The first breath of dawn, the first promise of movement. Lysander watched his small sleeping army, a merchant, a farmer, a nobleman, a mother, 2 sleepy children, and a loyal horse. They trusted him. They slept because he was awake, and that was a quiet blessing and a heavy crown. When the sky finally lightened, he rose from the cold earth, stretching sore muscles and stiff joints. The smell of roasted barley coffee drifted through the clearing, warm, bitter, hopeful. The time for contemplation was over. The time for action had returned. He brushed Danton's neck, speaking to him in a soft voice only the horse could hear. They would climb, slowly, steadily, silently. The mountain waited in the distance, shadowed and steep. But the abbey waited beyond it, and that was enough. The caravan, a small army of frightened hearts held together by loyalty, began to wake. And as Lysander took the reins once more, the world recognized his resolve. The journey continued, quiet and determined, toward a promise made in wax and sealed in faith. The young Lysander felt the mountain air on his face, cold, thin and sharp, with the scent of pine and stone. It woke his senses, even as the climb exhausted his body. The wagon slipped on loose gravel, and Danton released a low, strained grunt with every step, a sound of hard labor that blended with the soft whisper of wind curling along the ridge. Isabel walked at the horse's side, offering small handfuls of dry hay and murmuring words of encouragement. It was a quiet bond, a gentle strength, as if her voice alone placed a hand beneath the horse's ribs and lifted him another inch up the slope. human and animal moving as one, linked by effort and kindness. The caravan climbed in a slow rhythm of determination, every person absorbed in their task. Gautier and Émile steadied the wagon whenever the wheels slipped or skidded, their hands full of rough wood and cold stone. Their shared strength kept disaster from happening, a silent reminder that unity, not speed, was what kept them alive. Lysander focused entirely on the reins. Small adjustments, careful pressure, each movement meant to ease Danton's burden. It was patience, as much as strength, a steady hand rather than a forced command. Lord Valerius, lying in the back of the wagon, coughed weakly and called for Lysander. In a low whisper, the knight warned him about a stretch of crumbling earth just ahead on the trail, and explained how mountain travelers used exposed roots and shrubs as anchors to steady a wagon. A small gift of soldier's wisdom from a man who could offer little else. Lysander listened, learned, and nodded, grateful for knowledge that might save them all. Behind him came the soft voices of the children, whispering questions to their mother. Tiny flickers of curiosity in a landscape of danger. Isabel answered them with stories of castles hidden in clouds and rivers full of silver fish. Their childish voices, light, imaginative, unbroken, were proof of what the caravan fought to protect. The air smelled of pine resin and crushed needles, mixed with sweat and dust from horse and men. The sun warmed Lysander's face, but the wind along his back was cold, a contrast that kept him awake, alert, alive. He lifted his eyes toward the ridge above them. If they reached that height, they might see the valley beyond, and perhaps a path to safety. Gautier paused to clean Valerius's wound, spreading a dark, herbal balm across the angry red cut. The salve smelled sharp and sweet, a promise of healing carried in its scent. Valerius whispered his thanks, grateful not only for the medicine, but for the care. Émile cracked open a stone along the path and showed Lysander the glittering quartz inside, a tiny star caught in rock. He explained that mountain folk believed such stones protected travelers from lightning in storms. He pressed the cool shard into Lysander's hand, a simple charm of faith and luck. Lysander tucked it into his pocket with quiet respect. Valerius's thoughts drifted to the healer who once saved his life, and he spoke softly of her, a woman who stood firm while armed men fell around her. He saw the same quiet courage now in Isabel, strength not of steel or titles, but of heart. The young guide felt the weight of Valerius's silver ring in his pouch, a reminder of the noble life he protected and the danger that followed them. He tightened his grip on the reins and listened to the rhythm of Danton's steps, steady, loyal, enduring. The wagon inched upward, slow, determined, unbroken, different classes, different stories, bound by the same narrow trail and the same fragile hope. Lysander felt the rough leather, the hard wood, the beating heart in his own chest, and believed with quiet certainty that they would reach the top. Lysander's caravan finally reached the top of the mountain trail, and the world changed in an instant. The air was thin and icy, sharp with the scent of pine and frozen stone. The wind tore across the rocky peaks in wild, sweeping gusts, a fierce whistle of freedom that echoed across the silence. Before them stretched a vast and breathtaking panorama, green valleys rolling far below, silver streams winding like threads of light, and on the horizon the faint, dark outline of a walled city. Civilization rising out of the wilderness, beautiful, yes, but full of new dangers. Lysander brought Danton to a halt so the horse and the passengers could catch their breath. He pressed his hands to the cold, moss-covered stones and felt the solid earth beneath his palms, a comforting touch after the long, tense climb from the forest. Sweat and dust clung to all of them, but it was the scent of survival, the quiet reward of a duty fulfilled. The wind was now the loudest presence on the mountain, a constant howl so strong that speaking aloud was almost useless. Lysander communicated with Gautier and Emile only through gestures, quick signals, shared glances, the silent language of travelers who had learned to trust one another. Valerius, more alert after reaching higher ground, used his trembling hand to draw a map in the air, showing a route that curved around the fortified city and avoided its toll gates. A safer path, if slower. Isabel took advantage of the pause to pass around the last pieces of bread and dried meat. The salty flavor woke tired bodies and warmed them against the cold air. She reminded the men of an old mountain belief, that giants and unseen spirits lived among the peaks, and travelers should leave a pinch of salt on the rocks to earn safe passage. Even in fear, there was room for ritual and hope. Gautier, who knew the roads of merchants, pointed out a low shrub growing from a crack in the stone. Its leaves were tough, sharp-edged, and smelled strongly of spice. He explained that traders brewed them into a tea to fight mountain sickness. He gathered a handful, a small act of wisdom that meant more than comfort. It meant readiness. Lysander felt the weight of Valerius's ring and the sealed parchment inside his bag. One noble, one practical, one sacred, each object a piece of the life he carried with him. He looked out across the sweeping valley and felt his own smallness, but also the strength of the united caravan behind him. Together, they were stronger than the mountain, stronger than the men who hunted them. Emile watched the sky with a farmer's trained eye. He pointed toward dark, heavy clouds forming in the distance, a sign of hail, the kind of storm that could shatter wood and cripple horses on open rock. They needed shelter, and fast. The descent was far worse than the climb. Every step down the mountain felt like a wager with fate, and the caravan moved at a painfully slow pace, guided by caution and the quiet fear of a single misstep. Lysander held tightly to Danton's reins. The horse's hooves slid on loose stones, and the sharp scrape of iron against granite echoed through the mountain air, a constant metallic reminder of danger beneath them. He could feel the strain in the animal's muscles, the tremor of effort traveling up the reins and into his own arms. That shared tension kept him from giving in to fear. The wind intensified, whistling harshly between the cliffs and carrying with it the unmistakable scent of rain and wet earth, the warning breath of a storm. Gautier and Emile worked in perfect rhythm, bracing themselves against the weight of the wagon, using ropes and their own bodies to slow the wheels and prevent it from sliding downward. It was trust in motion, the only thing standing between the caravan and disaster. Isabel stayed in the wagon, shielding her children and Valerius. Her voice rose in a soft lullaby, a gentle melody fighting against the roar of the wind, a little island of peace in the chaos. She passed Lysander a cup of the mountain leaf tea Gautier had prepared. Its sharp, spicy smell drifted upward from the cup, and he felt the warmth settle into his hands before he ever tasted it. The tea was bitter, but its strength spread through him like a spark, rekindling his focus and resolve. Ahead, the valley opened like a promise. Green, distant, safe. And somewhere beyond that horizon lay the abbey. Valerius lifted his head and spoke with urgency, pointing toward a dark hollow in the rock wall, a cave, small but deep enough to shelter them. His voice trembled with exhaustion, yet even now he was the one who saw danger first. Lysander guided Danton toward it, using the last reserves of strength the horse had to give. A quiet cultural note lingered in the air. Mountain caves were often used by hermits and monks, silent refuges for meditation and prayer. Finding one here was a hopeful sign, proof that the abbey could not be far, and that even in the harshest places the mountain held pockets of faith, They reached the cave just in time. Rain and hail exploded against the stone outside, loud enough to shake the air itself, but inside, darkness wrapped around them like a shield. The smell of damp moss and cold stone was strangely comforting, a scent of safety. A quiet peace settled over the group. Lysander leaned back against the cave wall, feeling the cool, wet stone press into his spine. It grounded him. It reminded him they were still alive. The slow breathing of the children was a gentle rhythm in the quiet, and Danton stood near the entrance, warm, solid, and calm. Outside, the storm raged. Inside they rested, a small circle of souls held together by courage and faith, for now they were safe. The hailstorm ended as suddenly as it had begun. The world shifted again, slowly this time, and the change in the mountain, the air, and the hearts of the caravan felt almost like a gentle exhale. Light spilled softly through the mouth of the cave, a pale, silver-grey glow reflecting off wet stone. The brutal cold of the storm faded, replaced by a damp chill that clung to skin and fabric. Lysander breathed in the scent of wet rock and moss, the clean, earthy smell of land washed by rain. It soothed the tightness in his chest. The fierce howl of the wind was gone. In its place came the soft dripping of water running down the cave walls. Drop after drop, steady and rhythmic, like a quiet natural clock marking the passing of time. That simple sound, the peaceful repetition of water falling, worked like a balm on frayed nerves. It lulled Lysander into a calm, resigned serenity, a gentle contrast to the fear and urgency that had driven them into the cave. The mood of the group changed as well. The sharp fear of mercenaries, the battle against the mountain, and the violence of the storm shifted into a deep, heavy exhaustion, a silent satisfaction simply for being alive. Gautier and Emile were spent, but their bond had only grown stronger. They traded short nods and quiet glances, a language of trust that needed no voice. Isabel and the children slept again, their slow breathing becoming the new rhythm of the caravan, the sweetest sound in the world after so much danger. Lysander leaned back against the smooth, cold wall. Its steady solidity grounded him, a reminder that, for now, they were safe. Lord Valerius finally slept deeply, no longer mumbling through fever. The sharp, herbal scent of Gautier's ointment mixed with the smell of pine and stone, a quiet perfume of healing and hope. The noble's rest was an enormous relief to Lysander. He knew that Valerius's survival meant the survival of all of them. While the others slept, Lysander checked on Danton. He ran his hand over the horse's wet coat, feeling the warmth beneath it. He offered a small handful of dry hay he had saved for moments like this. The horse chewed slowly, and that simple sound, steady, real, alive, was almost as comforting as a prayer. Lysander's contemplation deepened. He realized that courage in these times wasn't only about swords or battles. Sometimes courage was quiet, found in care, in patience, in the silent work of keeping one another safe. Every step they took as a group proved that unity, not strength alone, was the true key to surviving the medieval road. He looked toward the cave entrance. The afternoon light outside was soft and grey, promising a small window of safe travel before night returned to the mountain. The cold was still sharp, but inside the caravan lived a shared determination, a warmth of spirit stronger than the storm. Soon they would move again. Young Lysander could feel the weight of Valerius's silver ring and the sealed parchment inside his satchel, a pairing of duty and nobility resting against his chest. He quietly reviewed the path down the mountain. After the storm, the stones would be slick, and every step would demand caution. The image of the abbey, Saint Félix de Raymond, returned to his mind again and again. It had become a mantra, a lighthouse glowing steadily through the fog of exhaustion and the uncertainty of the road ahead. Gautier was the first to wake. He shifted against the cold stone, rubbed his arms, and offered Lysander a piece of hard bread and a swallow of wine. It wasn't much, but that small gesture of companionship felt richer than any treasure. The wine was bitter and sharp, warming Lysander's throat and pushing away the last traces of sleep. Emile used the quiet to gather drinking water, catching the clean drops that still fell from the rocks. He explained in his simple, practical way that mountain water, filtered by stone and height, was the safest to drink. Lysander tasted the cold, fresh water, and it washed down his fatigue with a sudden, welcome clarity. Ahead lay the steepest part of the descent. He could already feel it in his bones. This would be the hardest stretch. It would demand his strength and the full cooperation of everyone traveling beside him. He lifted his gaze. The clouds above moved slowly, revealing brief patches of deep blue sky behind the heavy grey. The contrast was gentle and poetic, a quiet reminder that peace still existed somewhere beyond the storm. It helped him breathe. The caravan began preparing to leave the cave. The sound of the cart being pushed over the rocky threshold echoed off the stone walls, a rough, determined sound full of effort and quiet courage. Lysander tightened his grip on the reins. Valerius lay in the wagon's bed, and the responsibility of guiding them safely down the slick mountain rested squarely on his shoulders. He accepted it without complaint. He focused on Danton's slow, steady rhythm. Each careful, deliberate step was the only music the journey needed. The repetition calmed the fear inside his chest. Before turning away, Lysander glanced back at the cave. Their shelter, their salvation for one terrible night. Gratitude washed through him. Stone had protected them when the world outside had tried to break them. Now it was his turn to protect them in return. The descent was steep, wet, and unforgiving, but the caravan moved forward with patient determination, the kind born from hope. The wind brushed against Lysander's face, cold and sharp, carrying with it the quiet promise of the abbey, and he kept going. The caravan left the quiet safety of the cave, and the slow shift of the journey revealed itself in the wet, slippery trail ahead. The ground was a mixture of mud and loose stones, soaked by hail and heavy rain. The air carried the sharp scent of pine and drenched earth, cold, clean, and deep in the lungs. Lysander tightened his grip on the reins. Danton's hooves slid in small, nervous arcs, and every careful step had a sound of caution. The young guide focused on the feel of the leather, cold, damp, and firm in his hands, and forced himself into an imposed calm, the kind of serenity born from danger and the knowledge that a single mistake could send the wagon tumbling. Gautier and Emile walked on either side of the cart, using their bodies as counterweight. Their breathing was heavy and synchronized, their muscles tight with effort. It was a quiet act of solidarity, a silent promise that none of them would let the cart slip. Isabel whispered a prayer of protection, a soft, repetitive melody that blended with the gentle dripping of water on stone. Her voice soothed the children, and strangely it soothed Lysander too. The damp wool of her cloak carried a familiar human warmth, a comfort against the cold isolation of the mountain air. He kept his eyes on the valley opening below, and in his mind the abbey, still distant, shone like a lighthouse. Repeating that goal again and again anchored him in a world full of shifting dangers. Valerius, though weak, remained alert. His voice was low but steady, guiding Emile towards safer footholds and pointing out where the rock was firm enough to bear weight. Experience gave authority to every whisper. Lysander absorbed each instruction as if Valerius were handing him a new piece of armor. Beneath his boots, the stone was cold and slick, yet solid, a strange comfort compared to the shifting mud. He thought about the parchment resting in his satchel and how a simple delivery had transformed into a burden of survival and protection for everyone traveling beside him. Gautier tapped his shoulder and showed him a patch of moss growing along the rock. He explained that this kind of moss signaled the presence of drinkable water. The damp, earthy scent of it was sharp in the air, fresh, alive, and it pushed them onward with a small spark of hope. Lysander's contemplation deepened. A medieval journey, he realized, was a constant battle against nature and chaos. Their wagon wasn't merely a vehicle, it was a moving, fragile civilization held together by courage, patience, and solidarity. The sun, now lower in the sky, cast thin golden beams across the mountain's face. The warm light was a gentle, poetic contrast to the storm that had nearly broken them. The descent continued, slow, tense, and careful, but Danton's steady rhythm became the closest thing to safety they had. Then at last, the ground evened out. The wagon rolled onto firmer soil, and the pace began to rise. The sound of Danton's hooves striking dry earth was like a new melody, one of relief, of movement without fear. Lysander lifted his face toward the sun. Warm light brushed across his skin, and the distant promise of the abbey pulled him forward once more. He smiled to himself, a small, quiet smile of acceptance. Fear had faded into relief, and relief into resolve, and the journey continued. Lysander's caravan had finally reached the plain, and the slow shift in scenery was unmistakable. The dense mountain forests faded behind them, replaced by open fields and soft, rolling ground, where the smell of grass and freshly turned soil was strong and clean in the afternoon air. He could feel the difference beneath the wheels of the cart. The earth was firm and even now, allowing Danton to move at a faster, steadier pace, a rhythm of relief and quiet speed, and the new melody of their journey. A sense of calm settled over them, the quiet certainty that their destination was close. Lysander felt the tension in his shoulders loosen as the shadows of the mountains disappeared behind them. Still, the threat of mercenaries hadn't vanished completely, only receded into the distance, like a bad dream fading in daylight. He looked ahead, and on the horizon, the silhouette of Saint-Félix-de-Raymond Abbey began to rise from the fields, a peaceful stronghold of stone and quiet faith, the final beacon of his mission. The memory of everything behind them seemed to gather inside his satchel, the parchment, the silver ring, the symbols of duty and honor that had transformed him from a lone traveler into the guardian of a small, fragile kingdom on wheels. Gautier and Emile sat together on the cart, more relaxed than they had been in days. The mercador told Emile a small story about distant spice markets and the dangers of the sea, a gentle contrast to the dangers of the road. His voice was lighter now, no longer hardened by fear, and the sound of it felt like a soft exhale for everyone listening. Lysander felt the warmth of the afternoon sun on his face and the soft breeze drifting across the fields, carrying the scent of harvest. A living reminder that the world was still rich with life, despite their struggles. He focused on Danton's steady hoofbeats, each one firm and rhythmic, a soothing promise of arrival. Isabel and the children were awake, and their quiet laughter and small conversations anchored the group in something beautifully ordinary. She pointed out a field where farmers used a wheel plow, explaining how this new tool made the work easier and the harvest more abundant. It was a true piece of medieval ingenuity, a quiet kind of progress rarely sung about in stories of knights and kings. Lysander listened with genuine interest. Life in the Middle Ages, he realized, was not only made of war and danger, but of invention, labor, and countless small improvements brought to the earth by ordinary hands. He glanced at Danton and felt the bond between them, a silent partnership of muscle, breath, and trust. Lord Valerius, now lucid and calm, called him closer. With a quiet voice, he instructed Lysander to leave the main road and follow a narrow stone path hidden by the fields, a secret back route that led directly to the abbey's rear gate. It would help them avoid patrols and unwanted eyes. Lysander nodded with gratitude, feeling the urgency behind the noble's whisper. He slipped a hand into his satchel and touched the silver ring, cool, smooth, and heavy with meaning. Just a few more miles. The refuge was near. The caravan followed the stone path, and the landscape slowly revealed the abbey ahead. Its grey walls and tall towers rose over the horizon, a vision of strength and peace, and a relief to Lysander's tired eyes. A faint breeze drifted from the monastery grounds, carrying the scent of incense and cool stone, the unmistakable aroma of sanctuary and safety. Lysander felt the atmosphere shift around him, a quiet awareness that their journey was about to end and that their small caravan, this unlikely family, would soon part ways. He glanced at Gautier and Emile talking softly, and he knew that the story of their bond was a treasure he would carry for the rest of his life. Gautier shared one final bit of medieval wisdom. He explained that monasteries were often the largest producers of beer and mead in the region, and that beer was considered safer to drink than water from the streams. It was a practical truth, but also a gentle touch of humor that lightened the tension of arrival. Lysander smiled. Even on the hardest roads, history found its way into conversation. He guided Danton forward, and the horse seemed to sense the stables nearby. Each hoofbeat was steady, like the last quiet song of their long journey. Isabel called to Lysander and handed him a small piece of honey bread, a gift of gratitude and affection. The sweet taste melted on his tongue, a soft reminder of kindness in a world shaped by dust and hardship. He felt the warmth of the honey bread in one hand and the weight of the parchment in the other, simple and noble objects side by side, the true essence of his mission. At last, the caravan reached the abbey's back gate, a discreet arch hidden beneath the stone walls. Lysander's heart beat with a mix of relief and tension. The end was close. The promise was moments away from being fulfilled. He brought Danton to a stop and met the gaze of Lord Valerius, who opened his eyes and offered him a look filled with gratitude and silent respect. No words were needed. Honor spoke for both of them. Lysander knew the moment had come to deliver the parchment, to hand over the wounded noble, and to say goodbye to the companions who had become his family. The courage of traveling by cart was never only about facing danger. It was the courage of holding hope together. The abbey glowed softly in the gentle gold of late afternoon, and peace waited just beyond its walls. Lysander raised his hand and knocked on the heavy wooden gate. The sound echoed across the stone. His mission had reached its end. Lysander felt the weight of the silence that followed his knock on the gate of St. Félix de Raymond Abbey. The dull echo of wood against stone walls sounded like a promise fulfilled, the final note of a long and dangerous journey. A faint draught slipped beneath the heavy wooden door, carrying the scent of cool stone and incense. It was the fragrance of sanctuary, a gentle contrast to the dust, sweat, and pine that had clung to him on the road for so many days. A soft peace settled over him, a natural ending written into the air itself. He turned to his small caravan, the family he had found along the way. Gautier and Emile stood alert but calm, and Isabel held her children close, resting in a quiet relief that spoke louder than words. What had begun from fear and necessity had grown into something unbreakable, a small and silent history of solidarity that he knew he would never forget. Images flickered in Lysander's mind. The freezing night in Ethelred, the rattling wheels in the darkness, the loneliness that had once been his only companion. Now, the fragile parchment in his bag, the weight of Valerius's silver ring in his hand, and the steady strength of Danton beneath the reins were the anchors of a journey that had changed him. The gate opened with a deep, slow groan. A monk stood in the doorway, stern face, tired eyes, robes of dark grey that brushed softly against the stone. Brother Anselm asked their purpose, and Lysander, quiet but steady, told him of their request for asylum and of the wounded noble inside the cart. The look in the boy's eyes and the faint scent of herbs and healing oils were enough to convince the monk of the urgency. Brother Anselm called for help. From the shadows of the inner courtyard, other monks appeared, moving with a silence and skill that felt like the opposite of every dusty, chaotic mile of their road. With careful hands, they lifted Lord Valerius and carried him toward the cloister, toward warmth, medicine and rest for both body and soul. Lysander felt a great tide of relief wash through him. He placed the silver ring in Brother Anselm's palm, proof of his mission and the honor that guided it. In return, the monk offered him fresh bread and a cup of warm wine. The soft bite of the loaf and the gentle heat of the drink were a simple mercy, and Lysander accepted them with humbled gratitude. He looked to his companions once more. Gautier and Emile received provisions and maps to safer routes in the south. Isabel and her children were welcomed into the pilgrims' lodging, a place of warmth and shelter where danger could not follow. The purpose of their union was complete, but its memory would stay. Lysander understood something quietly profound. Courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the willingness to move forward in spite of it. And solidarity, far more than swords or armor, was the only true law of the medieval road. He took a long breath, feeling the cool wind touch his face, a whisper of freedom and the beginning of whatever came next. He clasped Gautier's and Emile's hands, a silent bond of respect and survival. They promised to meet again on the trade routes someday, a small spark of hope for the future. Then the mercer and the farmer disappeared down the valley, leaving Lysander alone with Danton before the great stone gate. The young guide stroked Danton's muzzle, feeling the warmth of the horse's breath and the quiet strength beneath his skin. He whispered his thanks for every step, every burden, every danger faced together. The horse had been the unseen hero of their tale. Finally, Lysander placed the parchment in Brother Anselm's hands. The monk nodded, accepting the burden and the honor of it. The promise had been kept. The road ahead was unwritten. Night was slowly settling over the abbey, and the starlight began to appear in the dark sky, a quiet cloak that wrapped itself around the young guide. The sense of peace ran deep, a well-earned silence after the turbulence of the road. He felt light and renewed, with a heart full of stories and a body finally allowed to rest. A poetic farewell took shape in his mind. He thought of the wagon, now nothing more than an empty vehicle, a symbol of a time that had passed, but the lessons of the road would stay with him, carved into his memory and his spirit. Courage was a slow, burning flame inside his chest. The young guide prepared to mount Danton and head to the inn in the village, where he would find rest and anonymity. His thoughts lingered on the invisible wealth of solidarity and honor, treasures far greater than anything Gautier or Valerius could have owned. The final climax was simply accepting uncertainty and trusting the future. Lysander knew new journeys were waiting, but he would face them with the strength of the union he had found on the road, the shield that guarded him from the world's disorder. He mounted Danton, feeling the texture of the leather saddle and the warmth of the horse's body. The sound of hooves on the stone path had become a rhythm of freedom and peace, a poetic contrast to the creaking of the wagon in the darkness of the first night. The promise had been fulfilled. Peace spoke through the silence that surrounded him, the stillness of the abbey and the calm of the starry night. He felt grateful for the courage of his companions and for the strength he had discovered in his own heart. The journey had ended, but the story would remain. Lysander and Danton moved slowly away from the abbey's gate, their silhouettes fading into the night, a small point on the vast and ancient map of the Middle Ages. The abbey's glow was the last guiding light behind them. The quiet farewell settled like soft dust, the end of a long vigil and the beginning of well-earned rest. He felt light and at peace, certain that courage was the only currency that truly mattered. The young guide looked up at the distant cold stars and felt connected to the vast, ancient world above him. He had survived, not through strength, but through solidarity and the honor of his promise. Serenity wrapped around him like a cloak. The last image he carried was the gentle light shining from the abbey windows, a sign of peace and refuge, the true reward of his journey. He was free for the next chapter of his life, guided by honor and courage. The touch of the silver ring, now in the monk's possession, marked the passage from danger to safety, the fulfillment of duty, the restoration of order. Lysander felt the empty space in his satchel, a light emptiness that meant his burden had been laid down and his oath completed. The memory of the road, the groan of the wagon, the howl of the wind in the mountains, the whisper of water and the steady rhythm of Danton's hooves turned into a quiet hymn of gratitude in his mind, a silent song of perseverance and faith. He thought of Isabel's smile and the wave of Emile and Gautier the road family destiny had placed in his path. Their faces of courage and hope were the true riches he carried, a legacy more valuable than any gold or silk. The young guide leaned gently against Danton's neck, feeling the warmth of the animal and the strength of his loyalty. The bond they shared was unbreakable, forged in danger and mutual trust. Danton was the silent companion of all his adventures. Courage, he realized, wasn't a grand gesture. It was a daily choice to protect the vulnerable and honor one's word. His simple life as a messenger had been transformed by the complexity of his duty as a guardian. A soft peace settled over him, the sense of belonging to that vast network of travelers and seekers of refuge. He wasn't a hero, just a man of duty, and that was enough to illuminate the darkness of the world. Danton's steps slowed, relaxed, the sound of a tired horse heading toward the village inn. The air carried the smell of warm food and fireplace smoke, the scent of a safe harbor waiting for him. Lysander felt the serenity of the night inside his chest. He had kept his promise and discovered his courage. The story of the wagon and its brave travelers was complete. A circle of danger, unity, and peace gently closed. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the quiet and the gratitude sink in. The last picture in his mind was the parchment safe in the abbey and the starry sky above it, a reminder that light always returns. Until tomorrow, traveler, I'll be here, waiting to journey with you through these forgotten ages. You already know where to find me, right here between history and dreams. Like this video, subscribe to the channel and sleep well.